My name is Johan Janssen, and I'm going to present this session, but you probably already guessed that, right? So we're basically going to cover a lot of tools and libraries, so it's not that I go in depth in them, I just show a lot of them, and then you can decide if it may be interesting for you and investigate them further, or attend a session specifically about the tool. So it's basically like a quick overview to hopefully inspire you and use some new tools that you haven't used before. So I work as a software architect at ASML, and all the examples that you see that I show, and a lot more even, it's almost 70 examples, are on my GitHub repository. So if you want to play around with it later or want to see other examples, please have a look at the GitHub repository. You can just type everything until my name, and then you can click on the Java Hidden Gems repository. If you want to contact me later, if you have any questions, feel free to approach me. If you have a short question, feel free to ask it in between of the session. If you want to discuss something, I'm walking around after the session as well. So let's get started, basically. I divided the tools and libraries in a few categories, so I will go through these categories one by one. But let's simply start with the first one, architecture. So for architecture, I'm going to show how ArchUnit works. It's basically like unit testing your architecture. So how does that work? It's a plain JUnit test, probably you are all familiar with that. And we can define rules. So this rule basically says, okay, every class inside a controller package, a Java package, which is annotated with the add-rest controller annotation from Spring, should have a name, so the name of the class should end with controller. And yeah, you can basically run these. I can quickly run one. And you see that it basically, so it passes, but in this case it means that it went wrong, because there is one class which basically doesn't have a name ending on controller because I called the class wrongly named, which is of course not fitting with the convention. And then we can have basically all kinds of other rules as well. So here I say that, okay, all the classes inside the payment package should only depend on classes that reside in any of these packages. So basically you define more or less layers in your application. And for instance, this one, so everything in common shouldn't depend on other packages, because then you have like circular references, which in general you don't want. And you can also define layers explicitly. So here you say that I defined a controller layer, which basically contains all the classes in the controller package. And then again, I can put in some constraints, like for instance, controller shouldn't be used by any other layer. It should only be used by the front end. And the service layer should only be accessed by the controller layer. So this way you can define all kinds of rules and run them automatically and make sure that your architecture stays in sync with what you defined yourself. Then we go to some testing tools. First one is Awaitility. Let's quickly show the example. So often when you have like asynchronous code that you've written and you want to unit test it, in the past a lot of people would put in a thread.sleep to basically wait for something. So what you see here, I have some future which also sleeps. But then if I use awaitility, what I can do is I can basically say, okay, await at most 2 seconds until some condition is true. In this case, I expect something to be added to a list. Basically, that happens here. So it actively looks at that list to see if it's finished. So that way you can quicker get the results. So if I run this, I have one. This is like the basic example. Here I do the thread sleep, which is more like the traditional approach. And you can see here with when I use awaitility, it's about 1 second. It didn't run the entire class. A second. And so here we see that this one took about 2 seconds with the sleep. And when you use awaitility, it takes like 1 second. So this is really helpful. I mean, normally when you do the sleep stuff and you have a quicker computer or something like that, it's not optimal. So with awaitility, you can make things like this a lot easier. After awaitility, we're going to look at the Jacoco agent. Probably a lot of you are familiar with how the Jacoco agent works because it's used to measure coverage for your unit test or your component test. But the cool thing is that you can use that Jacoco agent and tie it to your JVM process and actually measure any coverage that you have. So for instance, if you have like a performance test or you have like an acceptance test with Cucumber or whatever you have, you can run this. So let's show the example. So I basically supply this argument. Oh wait, I should use the correct directory, of course. So now it's started with the argument of the Jacoco agent. So you simply download the Jacoco agent and then you configure some stuff like what it should measure and things like that. And in the end, I supply my simple application. My simple application has a car endpoint. So if I go to a browser, I get some response. Really simple example. Then, to basically get the results, I need to stop the application, which is really important. When I did this the first time, I never got any results. The report stayed empty, and I had no clue why the report was empty. But the report is only written once you stop the application. So that's good to remember, because else you're waiting, like me, for a long time. And then, at the end, we can automatically create an HTML report, because otherwise you have some, I think it's binary format or something like that, which is not really readable. And then we can look at the results. Let's get a browser. So here you can see that, okay, my get REST endpoint was called indeed, because I called it from the browser, but the post mapping wasn't called. And maybe you're thinking, oh yeah, where should I use this for? We used it in the past. We had like acceptance tests, which covered quite well all the features that we had, or at least that's what we believed. So we ran it and measured the coverage and found out that quite large portions of the application weren't covered by those tests. And we found out that it was actually that code. We could remove it. And so there are quite some useful scenarios to try this one out. Then the next one is PyTest. PyTest is basically a way to test your unit tests. So let's get an example. So I have a really simple example which does something with some variables, some if-else constructions, and I wrote a test for it. So let's have a look at the test. It's a really simple test. I only test one case. So you already know I don't have a lot of coverage. I missed a lot of things with this. So what I can do now is I can use PyTest to get a better idea of what's going on. Let's see. I need to execute this command. Of course, it doesn't scroll. So all the commands I use and everything, they're basically inside the repository, so you can easily try it out yourself. So now we run PyTest, and what PyTest basically does is it runs the normal unit test, and then it changes your production code. So not the test code, but the real production code. So for instance, a bigger than sign will be changed to a smaller than sign. If you return some kind of int, it will randomly return 0 instead of a correct int. So it creates several variations. They call it mutants of the code. And they will run the test for each of those variations. So it can take a while. Maybe it's like 10 times as much as your unit tests. So it takes a bit longer. You probably don't want to run it for each commit, but you can do it nightly or something like that. And then each of those variations are tested again. And when that test succeeds, that basically means that the test isn't testing properly because the code was changed and the test didn't fail. So that is the way it automatically tests. I forgot to press enter. Your quality of the unit tests. And let's see, this also creates a nice report. So here you can see which lines I properly covered and which ones I didn't properly cover. You can see most of them I didn't properly cover. And it also shows basically what it changed and if that test still succeeded. So here it negated a conditional, it replaced an int return value for 0, so all kinds of different things. And here you can see actually which mutators I use. So you can choose yourself which mutators you want to use, I simply use the default ones. So I can really recommend this one if you want to see if your tests are of good quality. For example, in the past we tried to aim for 80% coverage because management wanted that, but you can reach that quite easily. You simply call a method and don't check any results and yeah, test pass basically. With this tool you can automatically see if that happens because then everything is red basically. Then we go to another test tool, which is test containers, which is actually a really nice one. So with test containers, what you can do is basically run Docker containers for your tests. So in my case, I wanted to demo it with a database, so I have a MySQL Docker container, which I specify. It's a bit to the right here. But you can basically use any Docker image that you want. So if you have Kafka or whatever, you want to test it in a unit-like or component-like test, you simply run it with this test container setup, add the annotation, add the container, and then you can do some logic. I created a really plain example which connects to the MySQL database and inserts some statements. And when I run this, it automatically starts up the MySQL Docker container. My tests are run against that container, and that's it. I no longer need to manually create databases or connect to some database somewhere. It's all wrapped inside the unit test, and that's really nice if you ask me. Then the last one for testing that I wanted to talk about is using Gatling for performance testing. And I combine it with JDK Mission Control, which is basically like a profiling and monitoring application, which was created by Oracle. In the past, you had to pay for it if you used it on production. Nowadays, it's completely free. You just need to download it manually. It's no longer included in the JDK, but yeah, it's a small step to do. So let's see. I think I still have to open the Gatling one. So maybe some of you have seen Gatling in the past. In the past, they only had a Scala DSL, so it was not like pure Java. Nowadays, they also have a Java DSL, which makes it even easier. So what you can see here is I connect to some endpoint, and then I specify a scenario. I loop 5 times over it, and then I basically check the 2 REST endpoints. So that's like the loop that we have, and outside of that loop, I can specify the number of users. So here I say, I want to have 8 users after 10 seconds. So it gradually builds up the amount of users. And for each of those 8 users, it will execute the loop 5 times. So that's like 40 iterations in total. I quickly have to start the application. And what I will do in the meantime, I will use mission control. Let's see, here is it. And so with mission control, I can connect to my application. So my application was car application, and I can simply start the flight recording. So let's do it for 1 minute. I just use defaults because I'm lazy, and now I quickly need to start my test. So otherwise nothing happens. So it starts the simulation. Basically now the users are ramping up and the tests are being executed. It gives some statistics, how the progress is going. So in this case it goes really quickly. And then it's done. And then we can again see the results in the target folder. Let's see, here, basic simulation. And then we have an index folder. So in the past, I don't know, maybe some of you also worked with JMeter. I did it as well. Found it also always a bit cumbersome, especially creating reports was quite of a drama, manually doing it in Excel and stuff like that. With Gatling, you get all this for free, basically. The report is just auto-generated. So you can see things like response times, which request went okay, which failed, things like 99 percentile, max and mean response times, the number of active users, basically a lot of details that you can have a look at. And they even have a tab with more details, which gives even more stuff. So I can really recommend if you want to do performance testing to have a look at Gatling. It's really simple to use. Just a Java DSL, you can also record scenarios and use those. So that's a really nice one. And so separate from that, we have JDK Mission Control. It's not related to Gatling, it's just that I can now show two tools at the same time. And this basically analyzes what went on in my application. So here it said, okay, have a look at your heap because it looks a bit weird. It was used by a few classes. Yeah, I have a really simple application, so that's why. And I can see a lot of detail in here. I can, for instance, see all the garbage collections, how long they took. I can see stuff like thread dumps. I can see which exceptions are being thrown by the application. And I can also see which methods took the most time while this application was run and while I did the profiling. So this is a really nice tool to get insight into your application with really low overhead. Depending on which measures you enable, you can get it with like 1% overhead and even use it in production while you have customers running on it. So it's really powerful. Then we go to the next set of examples, more implementation related. And there we will start with equals verifier. Who here ever wrote the equals method him or herself in the past? See some hands. Do you think it was correct? Not the first time, yeah, that's basically most of the times, yeah, indeed. So what I did here, I created a really simple student, and I created an equals method. Looks quite nice, quite simple, but yeah, of course, it's not properly implemented. And then I also created one which I fixed, and here you see what basically needs to be done. So it's a lot more stuff. And how do I test this to make sure that I actually have a proper equals method? Therefore, I use equals verifier. So with equals verifier, I can simply say, okay, for this class, verify that the equals method is properly implemented. First one, of course, it wasn't properly implemented. The second one, it doesn't throw anything, so that one is properly implemented. So this way, you can have unit tests with your code that continuously monitor your equals method if it's still a proper equals method. Really helpful. Then we go to GraphQL. So GraphQL is like queries to a database. Normally you have a REST endpoint, and then you access that data from that REST endpoint, and sometimes you need all the data from that REST endpoint, but there are often scenarios where you're not really interested in all the data. You just want to have a subset of it. So if we, for instance, look here, I have, let's see, this one. So I can do a request, and then I can say which kind of data that I want to get back. And so in this case, what I want is I only want the account ID back, and I want the number back of the account. For the rest, I don't want to have any other information. I can also change it, and then I say, okay, apart from that information, I also want to have the user returned. So I basically say to my REST endpoint, this is the data I want, and then the REST endpoint only gives that data back that you basically request, which makes it a lot more efficient. I've seen scenarios where you have download like 1 megabyte from a REST endpoint and only show an ID or a name field in the UI, which is a lot of overkill. Of course, implementing this is a bit more work than using plain Java. So if you look at this, you have to define some query mappings and stuff like that. So it's a bit more work, but it also helps a lot to make more efficient endpoints. And it's quite widely used nowadays. That's a lot of support from, for instance, Spring and also from front-end applications. Then I look at Apache Poi. So with Apache Poi, basically it's a library that you can use to work with any Microsoft documents, like Word, Excel, and things like that. So what I do here is I create a Word document, put some lorem ipsum text in it because I was really inspired, and set it in some different fonts, write it in the end as that Word document, and then I have another test which reads the Word document, counts the number of words, and puts that in an Excel sheet. Basically to show you can write and read these documents and manipulate them. So if I run this, let's see. And so I have a Word document, different text, different fonts, few paragraphs, and then my Excel document. So the Excel document basically makes a list of all the paragraphs, in this case 3 paragraphs, shows the text, which is a lot longer than this, and counts the number of words in that paragraph. So it's quite an easy example, but it shows how you can easily work with tools like this. And then we go to the next example, which is Java Poet, which is, I think, one of the better names if you create tools. Call it Poet, it sounds really fancy. So let's have a look what Java Poet does. So what you can do with Java Poet, you can basically dynamically create Java class files. So this is what I expect to end up with. A simple Java class with some getters and setters and a constructor. And this is how I can create it with Java Poet. So normally, probably you don't want to use stuff like this in like a normal application, but if you write a library or something and you want to dynamically generate code, then this can be really helpful. It allows you to completely specify how the classes should look like and how they should be generated. So it's a nice one to try out. But don't write your entire application like this, because probably you won't have many friends left in your team. Then I have one handlebars. So handlebars is a templating tool. And with handlebars, I can easily put some stuff inside a template. So this is my template. I'll make it a bit bigger. So probably all of you got some mails from recruiters some days, right? So I try to be a recruiter. I think I can do that job as well. So I specified a nice text with some variables in it, and those variables I can fill them with Java code, basically. And so here, I define all the data that I want, and then I can basically run this one. I'll make it a bit bigger. And so this is all the information that I have. So I want to have someone who has Graal VM experience for 20 years, because, I mean, that's what recruiters ask, right? Of course, if you do a Java application and you're a Java developer, you also need to know PHP. J2EE, still people think that exists. And some nice function title, because calling someone a developer nowadays doesn't cut it anymore, so we put in some nice titles. And let's see. Where my example ended up. I think I ran the test, right? Let's do it again. So in this case, I simply print the text. You can also, of course, put it in an HTML file or something like that. So here, all the variables are filled in. And of course, like many recruiters do, they forget to fill in everything, so you have some random name in it. And I put in some random information, so like good life-work balance, only 53 hours a week. And days off, we don't have that. And of course, you get a really high salary as well. So this way you can play around. Of course, this is a silly example, but you can make any template that you want. For instance, maybe to send emails or something like that, automatically to your users of the application, whatever you want. Then we go to JSoup, which is also, I think, a nice name to name your application. And with JSoup, what you can basically do is you can query applications. So this basically is like, how you call it, querying an HTML page. So this was a bit of a dirty HTML page. I create some Chocolatey packages, and I wanted to retrieve the number of downloads that I currently have. So with this, I can run this test. It goes to the website. It's a public website. Retrieves the data, and then basically I have to select which data I want, and I can print it. So at this point in time, I have a bit over 4 million downloads. So if you want to query with some HTML, this is a really simple way to do it, especially if you have proper IDs in your CSS, because here it's a bit, not so really nice if you ask me. I had to do some tricks to get it working. Then we go to the next one, which is called lib phone number. How often did you enter an invalid phone number when you filled in a form so that people wouldn't contact you? I mean, I myself, I'm guilty. But there is a library which allows you, lib phone number it's called, which allows you to test if the phone number is actually valid. And also get some information back, like the location. I'm from the Netherlands, so this phone number was from some town in the Netherlands. You can also get the carrier back for mobile numbers. So if you want to do anything with phone numbers and validate them, I can really recommend this simple, tiny library, which is really helpful. Then we go to MicroStream. So MicroStream is basically a way to store data object-oriented. So maybe you've used ORM mapping frameworks in the past, like Hibernate and stuff like that. This basically does it automatically for you. And it integrates really well with Spring. If you don't have Spring, it's also possible. But with Spring, it's a bit nicer. So basically, I can use the repository stuff from Spring and store stuff, remove stuff, query stuff, and it's automatically then stored in whatever data store I want. So I can specify that I want to store it in MySQL or Cassandra or whatever, and MicroStream takes care that the storage and retrieval is done automatically. Again, of course, with all those mapping frameworks, make sure that you use them properly, because it can also have some side effects, but yeah, it's a nice idea to work object-oriented with your data. The next one I wanted to show is Optaplanner. Let's see, I think I still have some application running somewhere. Not anymore. Then I can start this one. So Optaplanner is basically a tool to solve all kinds of problems, like conference scheduling, like distributing stuff if you have like a company who delivers goods or something like that, to optimize your route and things like that, all kinds of those optimizations. It failed. Yeah, there was still something running. Stop that one and start this one again. So it helps you to automate those things. It has some AI in it and some really fancy stuff, and you can do a lot of awesome things with it. So let's get a browser and show you how it works. So basically what I did is I have a lot of slots, session slots, and a lot of sessions. And somehow I want to distribute them properly. And I have some rules for that. And those rules, let's quickly show that, because that's, I think, the nicest part of it. Those rules, you declare them as solvers, basically, as they call them. And you can define any rule that you want. So I defined a few of them. For example, a room can accommodate only one session at a time. Would be weird, right, if someone else was standing next to me presenting another session. Really confusing. A speaker can also only talk about one topic at the same time. At least I haven't seen one who can do two at the same time. Speakers prefer to stay in the same room, then they don't need to walk. And a speaker prefers to do all the talks back to back, basically, to give them some extra challenge. If speakers have multiple sessions, they need to do them all at once. So it's, and a room prefers to host sessions in one language. So for instance, one room does all the Dutch sessions, another room all the English sessions. So some really, relatively simple rules that we define, and then we can basically run the solver, and it will automatically process and try to get the best result. It's different almost every time you run it, so that's also interesting. You see that here the different talks are here, so these are all English. This room has all the Dutch talks. But we see some funny things here, like 2 sessions in the same slot. How is that possible? I basically tricked the application. I have more sessions than slots. So it cannot get the optimum result, and you also see it here. I have 2 hard penalties. You can get hard and soft penalties to basically tweak the algorithm, and here we have an issue with that. Then there is another interesting thing, because I specified that if a speaker has multiple sessions, the speaker should do them all after each other. So here we see Sander Mak, here we see Sander Mak, here we see Sander Mak, and here we don't see him. And here we see him again. So there is one, basically I would have expected this one to end up here. But actually the reason for that is quite easy. What I basically said is, I compare slots to see if the speaker has slots after each other, but I only compare them with 30 minutes in between. But there is a long lunch break in between, which lasts like an hour. So basically, my rule here wasn't defined properly. It's a mistake on my side. So if you define your rules properly, it would have made all the sessions back to back. So it's a nice tool to play around with things like this. Then we have Apache Spark. So Apache Spark, it's mostly used if you have like huge amounts of data that you want to process across multiple nodes, huge data sets and stuff like that. But I found another really good use case for it, and that's using it to read large data files. Have you ever tried to read a file in Java? I mean, I always need to Google to see how all the stream stuff works again. Then I can finally open it. And I tried it to create this example as well with plain Java. And it uses an Amazon data set of 29 gigabytes. So it was processing, I don't know, for a really long time. And then it ran out of memory because I didn't have enough memory. With Apache Spark, that's all done automatically. So it's maybe a bit overkill to read a file. Normally, you do this for big data sets and multiple machines. But I quite liked, well, experimenting that it works this easy, basically, to do it. So it's 29 gigabytes. It's basically reviews from Amazon. It's like a public data set. You can just download it and play around with it. It has 41 million records in it. I basically process all of them, and then I filter them, because I wanted to know which reviews contain the text Java programming language. And then in the end, I check that it's indeed 28 results. So my tip to all of you, write more comments on Amazon with Java programming language in it, because then I get more results. And yeah, this basically runs, it runs a little while. It's not like instant, but I mean, it's processing 29 gigabytes, so that's quite a bit. And I will come back to this one in a second if it's finished, but let's quickly show something else in between, because more examples is better. And we have the toggles application, and with toggles, basically you can do feature toggles. I mean, you have a lot of great talks about feature flags and everything from Netflix and companies like that, but when you try it in practice, it's always a bit of a hassle to get those feature toggles working. And with toggles, it basically does some of the boilerplating for you. So, let's see, where is it, toggles? So it's a really simple Spring Boot application, nothing really fancy in here. I specify some enum bean. So let's look at that enum bean. So this is basically the different features that I have. One I enable by default, the other one I don't enable by default. So with some annotations and an enum, I can create my feature toggles. Then I can use them, for example, in my REST endpoint. So in this case, I say my awesome endpoint only returns something when awesome is active, so when the awesome feature is active. And for almost ready, I almost do the same thing. And if it's not active, I return nothing. So a really plain example. So if we run this, yeah, of course, I forgot to stop that one. Yep, up and running. Let's look in the browser. So I specified the console endpoint basically to do the administration. So this you all get for free, this dashboard. So here you can see this one is enabled and this one is disabled. That were the defaults. And when I go to the endpoints, so I had awesome. It returns awesome feature because that one is enabled. When I go to almost ready, it doesn't return anything because it's not enabled. So let's enable it, and then try it again. Now it works. And so it's a really simple tool to manage your feature toggles. So that were quite some implementation examples that I had. And also, let's see if my other example finished by now. Let's see, where is it? Hidden somewhere. I'll show that in a minute, but first let's look at some security tools. So for security, you have the OWASP dependency check, which is quite an interesting project. It automatically scans all your Maven or Gradle dependencies to see if there are any issues in them, any known security vulnerabilities. And it works relatively easy. I simply specify it in the POM file what I want to do. For me, I cached everything locally. So I have there's basically a huge file with all the violations. and I cache them locally so I'm not dependent on the internet, because sometimes at conferences that's not really stable. Normally, of course, you would use the live feed, because then you always have the updated issues there. And I can simply run this one. So let's do that. Of course, I put something in which is vulnerable for the example, because else it doesn't show anything. Let's see. I have Log4j. Who hasn't heard of it? Was really nice experience, right? That you needed to upgrade all your applications. And yeah, so here, this is just a plain output. It also creates an HTML, so you can also look at the HTML. I think you can also import it in SonarQube and tools like that. But let's keep it simple and simply look at the output in the console. So here it found that there is Log4j core is being used, and these are all the CVEs, common vulnerabilities, that were detected. So it's quite a few security risks in this one. You can also fail the build automatically if it detects issues of a certain severity. You can configure that all. So that's really helpful to make sure that you have an application without any vulnerable dependencies. You can really recommend that one, and it's completely free. There are some things changing in the CVE database. So they are thinking about rate limiting and stuff there. So yeah, if you start using it, have a look at that. So far it still works out of the box without any extra tweaks. But in the future it might become a little bit more difficult, but let's see how that evolves. Then we have the POSI library. And POSI is basically a way to define rules where your password needs to adhere to. So for example here, I think that all passwords should be between 8 and 50 characters. They should have 2 uppercase characters, 3 digits, 1 special character, doesn't have a sequence of 5 or more characters, and doesn't contain white spaces. So I can define some really simple rules that are easy to read, and then I can basically create a validator out of those, and then verify if my password is valid. So let's see. Here, for instance, I had a really simple password called password, so it doesn't comply. So the validator then basically gives me 3 return messages that I need to fix those 3 things. And then if I have a more difficult password, I see that I still have 1 issue because it has 3 numericals in a sequence. And then I have an even more complicated one and another complicated one, and those are of course valid. So if you ever want to write a password validator, probably this is better than writing a regular expression, right? Then we're going to have a look at some build tools. Who of you is using Maven here? Quite a few. So if you run Maven, you can do a plain Maven, or you can do a Maven daemon. And then do, for instance, compile. So first time it starts a daemon and it takes a little bit more, but then it basically processes everything at the same time in parallel and really quickly. While if I do the same with oh wait, that doesn't work, with Maven, takes a while, right? And so this, I didn't change anything in my code. So I simply installed the Maven daemon tool, and then instead of calling Maven, I call Maven daemon and execute the same stuff as I did before with Maven. You could even create an alias for it so that you can still use your Maven command and underwater call the Maven daemon. But this really speeds up the performance. So this took like 11 seconds, and this is only like simple compilation. If you do that with the Maven daemon, it was 5, 6 seconds, 7, 6 seconds. And so you win a lot with this. The bigger your project, the more you gain, basically. And you gain it all for free. So that's really a nice tool, if you ask me. Then some, probably a lot of you have heard of Docker and maybe even used Docker. And with Docker, you can either specify your images yourself, you write a Docker file and then configure it properly so that everything is in there that you want. But it has some drawbacks, basically. You need to know what you're doing there. And if you want to make it secure and performant and get small images, it's a bit of a hassle. Instead of doing that yourself, you can also use some of the tools that are available that automatically create these things for you. For instance, the Google tool called Jib. Jib basically makes sure that you get a Docker image automatically. So if you run these commands, then it creates a Docker image for my application, automatically makes sure that it's secure, that it has the latest versions of Java and the root operating system, basically. So that works really easy. And there is another one. If you use Spring, you can also use the default Spring tool and simply say Maven Spring Boot build image, and that creates a similar image. So it automatically picks a JDK from a vendor that they prefer, and it builds everything for you. Really easy. Only thing I encountered in the past was that I sometimes had when I switched from one Java version to another, that in one version it used one vendor, and in another version it used another vendor. So if you want to have like more control over it, there are some configuration parameters, but yeah, they try to abstract a lot of stuff away from you, which on one side is really handy. On the other side, yeah, you lose a little bit of control there. So yeah, it's up to you what to pick. We talked about the OWASP dependency check. It automatically scans your dependencies and gives you a warning if you have vulnerable dependencies. You can do it even better. I mean, instead of waiting until a vulnerability occurs, you can also try to keep your dependencies up to date, always. And it's a hassle if you need to do it manually. So therefore, what you can use is Renovate, and there are also some other tools like Dependabot who do the same. And what they basically do is they create pull requests. And you can configure all kinds of stuff with it, but simple explanation is they create pull requests. So in this case, it automatically created a pull request to upgrade this dependency from one version to another. You can run it, for instance, daily or weekly or whatever. It integrates with the GitHub Actions that I'm using. And that way, you basically have always up-to-date dependencies. You can even configure it that it automatically runs a build with the new version to check if it's indeed your application still works with that new dependency. And if so, automatically merge it to your main branch. So you can do a lot of cool stuff with this. And I can really recommend this to make sure you're up-to-date. Because this will also help you if you decide to upgrade to Java, like Java 17 or Java 21, which will be released in September. If your dependencies are up-to-date, upgrading is mostly a breeze. If they're not up to date, you often still need to update them before you can upgrade your Java. And then there is one tool which is in sort of more or less the same category as the stuff that I've shown before, and that's the old group ID alerter. So basically what this does is it checks if some of your dependencies got a new name. I think the most widely known example is within Java, we had the Java EE, which had the Java X namespace. Nowadays, it's no longer called Java EE, it's called Jakarta. So you can upgrade, for instance, JAX-B to the latest version within the Java EE namespace, but then you still have an old dependency. Instead, you should upgrade to the Jakarta one. And with this tool, you basically get automated alerts if you use some of those older artifacts with different names. It basically has a really long list with old artifact names and the new replacements or forks or whatever were created. Where is it now? Am I now going blind? It was there, right? Ah, there it is. So for instance, this one, there is apparently an older GraphQL dependency, and it now has a little bit different name. The same goes for the JavaX stuff. It's now Jakarta, so you should replace them. So these tools are really good to use together with like the OWASP dependency check and Renovate to automatically update your dependencies to the latest version. Then we have the Maven Enforcer plugin. So this basically, you can use this to define all kinds of rules where basically your dependencies should adhere to or where Maven should adhere to. So we can specify the required Maven version, required Java version, even required operating system. And then I can define some more interesting things like it's not allowed to define the same dependency with two different versions inside a POM, because I mean that doesn't make sense, right? And it's not allowed, so this one basically makes sure that if you have transitive dependencies, for example, log4j, if you use Hibernate, it probably has a dependency on log4j, and maybe if you use another tool, it also has a dependency on log4j, but with a different version. When class loading happens, it loads one of the two, so you might have some issues there. So with this, you can automatically check it and basically don't allow it. We can say we only want to have release dependencies, so no beta or milestone stuff. We can say which dependencies we don't want to allow or want to allow with even versions with it. And we can automatically fail the build on it. I don't fail it automatically now, but you can do that if you want to. And so this is a nice way to, again, manage your dependencies and some other configuration in your project. Then open rewrite. So out of curiosity, who's here still on Java 8? Older than Java 8? Someone? Java 11? So yeah, you see the majority is not yet on 17, and we already get 21 in a couple of months. And I also have a talk on upgrading Java, and that's what I noticed basically everywhere. A lot of projects are still on older versions of Java, because it's hard basically to estimate how much work it is. Management doesn't approve you to spend a lot of time on it, things like that. In practice, it's often not as hard as you think, but if you have to do it manually, it's still a bit of work. With Open Rewrite, it basically has some recipes that automatically upgrade stuff for you. So there are some recipes to upgrade from Java 8 to 11. There are recipes to upgrade from JUnit 4 to JUnit 5, the new Jupyter one. There are a lot of recipes that you can use. And that you can simply run on your application. So let's see how that works. Where's my POM file? So I can run this command. I have an old version of JUnit in it, so that will be upgraded. And some other things that will be upgraded automatically. So it's doing the JUnit 4 to JUnit 5 migration. You can basically specify whatever migration you want to have. It even has recipes to basically transform your project from using one, for example, REST library to another REST library. So there are really a lot of libraries available, so you should really have a look at that. And here we see what it basically did, but we can also simply look at the Git difference. So we see here it added a new JUnit Jupyter dependency. It removed the old JUnit dependency. It automatically did some formatting stuff for me as well. So I have some crappy formatting. It also fixed that automatically for me. It even improved some of the tests, like this test. It's better basically to, in an if case, when you use an equals, to start with the string, because else you could have a null pointer issue there. So it automatically translated that for me. So it didn't only upgrade it, it improved my code as well, which is really nice, I think. Changed the code here, so from JUnit 4 stuff to JUnit 5 or Jupyter stuff. Again, made sure that everything is laid out nicely. You no longer need to use the public keyword, so it removed the public keywords. Did some other changes, for instance, to specify folders where to store some stuff. Changed my assertions. Also changed the exceptions. So even exception handling you see at the bottom, it's changed a bit to make it easier to use. It also made those changes for free. And that was it. So basically now I have a git diff. I can commit this to my repository and I've upgraded my code base. So you could do this also for your Java code and run the recipes for the upgrade and then check what it changed and see if your application still runs. It's used more and more widely, so it's also more and more widely tested. So it's getting better and better. But of course, I mean, depending on how your code looks like, also make sure that you test yourself if still everything runs. But this is a really easy way to make the upgrade process a lot easier. And that was, for me, the last one I wanted to show. So if you want to have a look at the examples or more examples, again, this is the GitHub repository where you can find them. And if you have any questions or comments, let me know. Let's see how we're doing. We have some time as well. So if someone has a question now, let me know. Yeah.
So for the equals library, we're like usually going to be re-implementing the equals method because either, like a good example is like arrays by default, like you compare by reference instead of values, so like you want to change that, or in cases where you only want to compare certain fields and not compare other fields, like do you have control over like what isn't compared to equals?
So the question is, if you use the equals verifier, do you have some control if you want to deviate from the standard set of rules? I think there are some customizations, but yeah, have a look at it, I would say. It's a really actively maintained project, so it's continuously basically maintained still, so yeah. Yeah.
To the upgrade from 8 to like 17. When you do the upgrade, does it let you know if something else you incorporate? I know it's called like an upgrade and dependencies and Java, but like if you have other dependencies that connect to it, does it verify that? And also will it let you like make a change before it commits? Like does it say this is what's going to change? Do you still want to do that, or does it just change it and you have to fix that?
Good question. So with Open Rewrite, what's the control that you have, and how can you see that the results it produced are actually working? So what I showed was a git diff. So it made some local changes, and then I can decide for myself if I want to commit them. I can make other changes or revert stuff. I don't think it automatically checks if your application works, but that's relatively easy. You can simply build the application again with those changes and see if it works. But it's something I think you need to do manually. As far as I know, they don't check it from the project automatically. Spark results, good one. Let's check where it is. Should be finished by now, I guess. Quickly changed my view because I need to check where it was. I think it actually broke. Or I accidentally killed it. But it takes about, I think, 2 minutes or something to process it. So yeah, it's quite impressive to process that amount of data in such a short time on just my laptop without having any other things. So on the GitHub repository, and let's see where it is. So there is a list there which briefly explains each tool, and each tool then has an example in the code. So this is a brief introduction, yeah. And it contains links to all the projects. So if you want to know more, you can easily click on the links and use them. Yeah. Good. Then thanks all for joining, and have a nice day. Bye.